good afternoon, everybody. It's Tuesday afternoon, and we're really excited about Close of Business. We're always excited about Close of Business, but today we've got a phenomenal guest, Alex Pourbaix. He's the CEO of Synovus. And Alex is a good friend of the firm. And when we started thinking about, could we please get a Canadian perspective on everything that's happening, particularly in the public policy arena, i.e. Keystone and other fun things like that. Alex was the absolute first name we thought of. So Alex, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you.
Well, thanks, Maynard. I was really happy to do this, so I appreciate the invitation.
Well, let's get warmed up here and tell us all what's going on in the world. Mike Bradley, a lot of people talking about an OPEC meeting this week. What do you think? What else is going on?
Yeah, Maynard. Yes, we have an OPEC meeting this Thursday, and as crazy as it sounds, it's probably going to be non-contentious. They're going to be raising production. That is very consensus. The question is, how much are they going to be raising? Right now, they've limited themselves to a 500,000 barrels increase on a monthly basis. That's going to happen. The other thing that people are trying to want, and that's for April production. The second thing is, what are they going to do about Saudi's production? And that's just going to be what Saudi wants to do. Will they bring 1 million barrels back to the market so we have 1.4 million and 1.5 million barrels a day starting in April? We don't know yet. Obviously, Saudi is probably the least reluctant, is probably the most cautious of the whole group of members out there. And so my guess, it's not going to be brought all on in April. It's going to probably be brought on in phases. The question is how much. The point is, it really doesn't matter at this point in time because the market probably does need those barrels, and so Saudi will basically put the barrels as their customers want them. So I think it's very consensus. There's going to be a production increase. The question is how much, and I think the biggest surprise is if there is a surprise, to be honest with you. So this is one of the least contentious meetings I've seen in quite a bit of time.
Okay, so you say not contentious, but give us a range. Give us a worst case, like a Saudi-Russian food fight breaks out, and give us a best case. Like, how should we bracket this meeting?
Now, I think worst case scenario is the 1.5 million, and I think that's where consensus is at right now. I think the best case scenario is something less than 1 million. Saudi brings half of the production cuts back in April, and maybe half of the production cuts back in May. I think that would be a nice surprise for the market. And so, like I said, all the cards are in Saudi's hand at this point in time. They're going to be raising production. And something we've been saying for the last several weeks is that I would rather have OPEC raising production to a market that needs those barrels as opposed to OPEC having to pull barrels off because the market's just not there. They're in a really good position right now. There's going to be obviously some contention between Russia and Saudi because there always is. It's probably going to be more so in the press than there really is. But guess what? Russia is going to get production increases. Saudi's going to get production increases. OPEC's going to get production increases. And so we've got a market that's, needs those barrels at this point in time. And so unless we have something happen to the global economy, I think, we're going to be just fine. Now, as it relates to where investors are, investors don't want to do anything this week. They still have some uncertainty of what's going to happen, at this OPEC meeting. And so they're not doing anything. I don't think you're going to see much of a pullback in prices. I don't think you're going to see much of a pullback in equities. Once the meeting's through and that risk is behind us, I do think that you're going to see, people continuing to buy these names. I mean, it's just that simple.
All right. Matt Portillo, what's going on in your world? I know you've got some conferences and some things coming you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, Maynard, I figured I could share 2 slides that we published last week. I know on COBT, we've been talking a lot about inflation, and that's obviously a positive thing as it relates to the traditional oil and gas industry, but it is potentially going to be a headwind for battery cost. And we published a deck that just kind of walked through what's been happening with metals prices year to date and what that ultimately does to our BATPAC estimate for battery cost in 2020. So just to give you a little bit of context on the first page here, you can see that nickel pricing is up about 18% year to date, and cobalt pricing has actually skyrocketed up at about 53% year to date. Those are 2 key components of the cathode and the battery makes up about 50% of the material cost. So overall, as that price is rising alongside lithium, which is up about 44% year to date, we're actually starting to face some headwinds on the cost structure. Just to give you a little bit of idea of what this ultimately means for our estimate for battery costs, as a reminder, we think at scale in 2020, battery costs had fallen to about $130 to $135 per kilowatt hour. And ultimately, to get closer to ICE parity, the industry needs to see that cost fall towards about $100 per kilowatt hour. Just on the sensitivity of this metal price increase we've seen year to date, that adds about $5 to the cost structure. So we may not actually see battery costs fall this year, which may be a bit of a surprise to the market. If you look back over the last decade, we've fallen from about $1,000 per kilowatt hour down to that 130 level. So the industry and the market has been very comfortable with costs continuing to march lower. And this is something that I think investors need to pay attention to and watch as we move forward, because it is going to be an important discussion for the industry as a whole.
So one question, can I just ask you, Matt, will everybody do that math the same? Because it seems like one problem we always have is everybody's doing, different numerator, different denominator, and people don't, they disagree on these trends. But do you think this one's pretty straightforward? Both on those prices are obvious, but in terms of the cost per kilowatt hour, will people really see it this way, or will there be a debate?
I think there will be a debate, and the primary reason that's the case is we went through and spent the last 6 months researching our work on the automotive industry. One thing that we found was that the battery market in particular is quite opaque. You tend to have a survey done by BNEF, and there are a few other shops that have actually built up models. We were lucky enough to actually find the Argonne Lab national model, which actually allows us to sensitize a lot of these inputs and actually come up with our own forecast. But quite frankly, it's an area that the industry really doesn't disclose a lot of information on, and I think it will be a bit of a surprise. So it's something that we're going to be tracking, something we'll be talking about, and hopefully something that we can keep clients up on. On that same discussion point, I just do want to highlight for those listeners on COBT, TPH will be hosting a battery conference on March 31st. It is an all-day conference. The lineup is fantastic. And so if you do have interest in batteries, both on the utility storage side as well as for the EV market, and also discussions around the solid state potential, feel free to reach out to your TPH representative and we can get you guys signed up for that conference. But we're really excited about it. I think it's going to be a great event.
Well, and for all my friends who are watching, yes, I am your TPH representative. I can see the emails now. So, Colin, a big week I was going to say in Houston, it's a big week virtually because Sierra was rocking and rolling this week. I know you had some thoughts there.
Yeah, it's been really cool to attend the conference virtually. You can see in the chat rooms all these greetings from Mozambique, Nigeria, all over the world. So it's really got a flavor of being a global community meeting in real time. And frankly, my impression is it's just very, very encouraging to see the tone at this conference. Specifically, there have been a number of speakers who have gone out of their way to talk about hydrocarbons as opposed to fossil fuels. In fact, this morning, John Kerry said, I don't object per se to fossil fuel. I object to the byproduct carbon and methane. So we need to abate, we need to pursue every form of energy. So here it is, all energy, all the time. And you're beginning to see this greater sensitivity of not just having blanket prescriptions against hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, but to perhaps recognize that not only may hydrocarbons have a role to play during and after the energy transition, but that they may be critical, particularly through the blue hydrogen component. Kerry and others also said that they are pro-nuclear, CCUS, direct air capture. So it's just been a really interesting, good conference because some of the heightened emotion and yelling and screaming and partisanship that we've seen in recent years just is somewhat absent from this conference. And there really is an emphasis on the future and collaboration. And then finally, maybe two warnings. Almost everybody believes in pent-up demand. I mean, just one panel after another talking about how strong demand's going to be in the second half of the year. And, it has me a little bit nervous. Everybody has the same opinion. So if there isn't going to be as strong a demand move in the second part of the year, I would just flag that. And then finally, a very strong focus on hydrogen. And what's been interesting is, 3, 4, 5 years ago, the emphasis might have been on electric vehicles. Now suddenly it's on hydrogen. And if you think of the investment lead time that's required for many of these technologies, can you imagine if we had, as a global civilization, put all of our eggs in the single basket of EVs and pick that as the winning strategy. And now suddenly we have decided collectively that maybe there is a role for hydrogen, maybe there is a role for new technologies. And so I thought that was an interesting lesson, that if you listen to the rhetoric, it would remind you, keep an open mind on some of these investments. And then maybe one other point, the API, Biden, others are talking about a price of carbon. And so you have this question of the distinction between a price of carbon and a tax on carbon. And there is a distinction there. And so that was something I think gets glossed over sometimes. The Biden administration last Friday put a price on the social cost of carbon at $51 per ton. The ICE futures contract, which is about European allowances, is presently at $46 per ton. So they're closer than they were before, but there still is in the market a lower price than the one dictated by at least the US government.
That's great, Colin. No, I agree. Sierra's been fantastic. So congrats to our friends, Dan Yergin and Jamie Rosenfeld, on another awesome conference. And I would agree, so many of the conversations have been really, super, super thoughtful. It's not surprising given the lineup of guests, but it's refreshing. While we're talking about energy gathering places, I wanted to tell you all where I am today. I'm over at the Petroleum Club of Houston. It's the 75th anniversary. The club is a fantastic place. It's open. Like every restaurant or retail establishment, the club has seen a lot of diminished traffic this year, but they're fighting back. Numbers are starting to pick up. The reason I wanted to publicize it is it's obviously a landmark for oil and gas executives and energy more broadly. If you're interested in getting to know the club, Jeremy Milwee is the manager. They're open. Even if you're not a member, she'll find a way to get you in. Just reach out to her. You can experience it and think about joining, but it's a great place. They're great friends of all of us in energy. If you join here, I think almost every club around the world will let you in, at least all the energy ones. So this is a quick shout out to our friends at the Petroleum Club. Guys, let's go north of the border. And Alex, we're so lucky to have you. I think we realized a few weeks ago we were being terribly US centric in the way we talk about energy and the way we talk about Keystone and some of those types of things. So we, as I said, we reached out and we were really lucky to connect with you because we wanted a Canadian perspective on everything that's been happening. The energy world's been changing dramatically in the first part of this year. Over the last 7-8 months, it's been through what seems like 5 roller coasters of volatility. But welcome, and why don't I throw it to you just to give you kick us off with some things you've been thinking about doing and talking about from your seat up in Calgary.
Sure, Maynard. Once again, thanks for the opportunity to join your event. This is awesome. No, I think like most of the people in the upstream business, and I don't think it really matters sort of what jurisdiction you're in. For a lot of the past year, we've been really focused on survival, and nobody was hit harder in March than the heavy oil business in Canada. So that was really kind of the focus for the first few months of the year, and then at the same time there was a incredible focus at driving our costs down. We at the time, no one had any idea how long this was going to last, and it was all about doing everything you could to survive. So, we and we did some really significant things as a company. We cut our capital massively. We implemented pay cuts for our staff. All the things that a lot of other companies did, but really, from the fall, and maybe even before, maybe even in the summer, from my perspective, it started to become apparent that, we were getting traction with vaccines. And that gave me a lot of comfort that the world was ultimately going to go back to normal. I'm a big believer that, once this pandemic is over, I don't think anything has fundamentally changed. I think people of this world are going to go back to doing the things they did. And if anything, kind of as was alluded to at the CIRA conference, I think people might go at it with a vengeance. And, whether it's air travel, whether it's, cruise ship travel, I fully expect we're going to see demand get back to where it got to. And so from our perspective, we started to look at, how can we best position the company to be successful as we come out of this. And, and that, if for us, that ended up in the acquisition of Husky, which I think a lot of your listeners would have seen. And for us, I have been like a broken record since I got to this company. And I've just been focused on three things. It's been cost structure, balance sheet, and market access, or call it maybe exposure to Canadian heavy oil discounts. And we looked at Husky, and we just saw this really once in a generational kind of opportunity to kind of comprehensively solve those issues. And I more to come, but I think we're feeling pretty good about that. The other things I think about, you alluded to it, but ESG, obviously a growing issue, particularly important issue for oil sands producers. And, there's a whole bunch of elements to this. There's an education element, both to, in our case, Canadians, Americans, politicians, investors, providers of capital. There's sort of an education and communication aspect of that. But there's also, I think, a real, it isn't just talking about it, and it's not just communicating what what we've done. A big part of it is actually continuing to show an improving performance on all ESG topics. I often say, we always talk about ESG. I wish we talk a little bit more about the S and the G elements of it, because I think Canada is at the top of the heap on all of those. And we end up spending 99% of our time talking about GHG intensity, which Canada actually has a pretty good story on. But it just takes all the air out of the room. So, last thing, I've been doing a fair bit, lots of interest from investors in the sector, and obviously growing interest over the past several months. So I've been spending a lot of time with investors and answering their questions about, the industry and Cenovus. So those sort of things that I've been focused on.
Look, that's a great kickoff. I guess, one thing, I'm sort of struck by two things, they're very counter to each other. Occasionally in this energy debate, you feel really optimistic. To Colin's point, you notice, like that John Kerry comment, or you notice really thoughtful conversations at CIRA, or you notice oil and gas executives, speaking out and pushing back on some things. And then you notice other things which just seem to make zero sense, and you feel it can be discouraging. I suppose it's hard to summarize in one single sentence which way we're really headed in all this, but how do you feel? Do you feel like the world is learning and getting better, or do you feel like the world is getting a little more irrational every day about the energy complex? There, you can drive a truck through that question, Alex. It's so wide, but that's I'm confessing my own emotions.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean, I will say, there were some times at some points, and I think it was particularly I think all of this insanity kind of reached a crescendo around your election in the fall. And, there were times when I was somewhat despairing of common sense, but, I have held a pretty particular view on this for a long time. And, what I've been frustrated with, and as I said, at Cenovus, we are very, very focused at improving our ESG performance. And, we think there's all kinds of reasons, good reasons to do that. And a concern of climate change is one of them. But what I have been frustrated about, though, is and I won't get the numbers exactly right, but you take a look at the percentage globally that fossil fuels represent of the total global energy consumption. And then you take a look after 30 plus years of developing the renewable business, it represents somewhere in the range of, pick a number, 5% of total energy, maybe 8% if I'm being very generous. And, it just strikes me that, we talk about an energy transition. I think the reality is we're going to continue to go through an energy diversification, but to suggest that you can just walk away from oil and gas in a relatively short period and not impact, consumers or quality of life, for people or the economy of countries. I just think people are not really being realistic on that aspect of it.
It's funny because at Sierra, as I said, you have this kind of new collaborative spirit, but there were a couple of people who said things like, no one's ever said we're going to stop using hydrocarbons. And I thought to myself, lots of people have said that. And what are you talking about? We've seen Brookline, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California want to ban it in residential use. And so the fact that you now see this pivot, the false claim that people haven't said keep it in the ground. I mean, obviously they have, shows, I think, that you're right, that people are beginning to realize, and maybe it was the Texas storm that helped them realize it, that you really needed that natural gas, and you're going to continue to need that natural gas. And if implicit in the way the mix was set up was that gas equals reliable, especially at a particular moment in time, I think that might be part of what's happening here. It's making people realize that some of their assumptions were too extreme.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a very interesting example of that. For many years, I was at TransCanada, or now TC Energy, and one of the duties I had back then was building up our power business, and ultimately we built up the largest private sector power business in the country, and we were one of the pioneers on renewable energy, both wind and solar. And one of the reasons at the time that we kind of started moving away from the renewable business is we were observing that, at the times, for example, in Alberta, there was a fundamental challenge of wind, and we found out, when energy peaked was when it was either really, really cold or really, really hot. And we found that in those periods, you didn't tend to get very much wind. So owning wind resources, you never captured the peaks. The corollary of that was it wasn't very effective at the times you needed it the most. And I don't take any pleasure in the horrible experience that Texas has had, but I do think you're correct on that I think it really did expose that a renewable power, a vibrant renewable power sector still requires, in most cases, fossil fuel backup or gas backup. And if you really factor in the cost of that, you start, I think, questioning to some degree, are the economics as rosy as they appear?
Alex, maybe just a follow-up question and something that you touched on. Chatting with our Canadian research team, it seems like one of the broader issues that we face when building infrastructure and pipelines specifically is the view that the Canadian oil sands are some of the dirtier barrels produced globally. And I was just hoping that you might be able to inform our viewers on how the industry might have changed over the last 10 years or so as Keystone has been kind of envisioned. And alongside that, maybe touch a little bit on two other important topics that you mentioned, social and governance, and especially as we're looking at taking incremental imports from regions like Saudi or Iran on the global market.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think, one of the really frustrating things for me as a Canadian upstream producer is this sort of dirty oil kind of connotation of the oil sands. And, I'll just, I could speak for other companies too, but I'd just speak on our behalf. Cenovus has reduced its GHG intensity per barrel by 30% over the last 10 or 15 years. And on top of that, we continue to implement technologies that continue to improve that. And if you look at our biggest, largest facility, which is Christina Lake, its GHG intensity right now is lower than the average barrel of oil refined in the US. And it's just been profoundly difficult to get the facts of that situation through the rhetoric, of the Engos and, the Greenpeaces of the world. So the entire upstream industry in Canada has been just like real and increasingly focused on ESG. And you make it goes to another frustration is, this obsession on the E side and not nearly as much attention on the social, the governance side. You look at in the Canadian industry, Canada, you will not find a better place where the rule of law is more enforced, where we have incredibly stringent and transparent regulatory regimes. We actually measure carbon at all of our facilities and report on that on a monthly basis, on a real-time basis. And on top of that, the largest employer of Aboriginal people in Canada is the upstream oil and gas industry. And you look at any of our facilities, and and huge amount of work is being done by Aboriginal and First Nation owned businesses. So this is we got to focus more on these aspects of it. And I get so frustrated. We're literally dealing with these tiny percentages of carbon, in differences in barrels wherever they're produced in the world. But anybody who thinks, with all due respect, anybody who thinks that the world is better off with more oil coming from Saudi Arabia or Russia or Nigeria, I would say has rocks in their head.
That put a great fine point on it there, Alex. I was just thinking we should do a RAND's ESG score, because surely being a state sponsor of terror hurts your score. I don't know how that factors in. Okay, forgive me for the cheeky comment, but Alex, the point about how things have gotten cleaner and are so much better, and there's no comparison. No good comparisons are made that really educate people. Are you seeing what are some exciting ways you're seeing to influence opinion in Canada? Are you seeing some new avenues, some minds being changed? This inevitably gets into politicians a little bit, and because people's votes shows up in state and government houses and such. But what's got you optimistic when you're finding the message is getting out there?
Maybe first I'll kind of talk a little bit about the problem, and I wonder if it's the same for you all in the States it is in Canada. But one of the observations I would have, and I had this, when I was at TransCanada and I was responsible for Keystone XL and Energy East and all these other pipeline projects, I would get so frustrated at the upstream industry that I would sit down with executives and I'd say, guys, we got to get your story out, because, we're getting killed by environmentalists and whether it's in the US or in in Canada. And I kind of came to the conclusion, my industry, the upstream industry, we're a little introverted when I think we've always, I've not met an executive that is not deeply concerned about the environmental impact of their operations, but we don't tend to talk about it, and we don't tend to celebrate the victories. We just kind of go about and kind of do our business and kind of think that the truth will come out. And so I have been pushing very hard, and in my own role since I've been at Cenovus, I've taken a pretty front and center view on being an advocate for our industry and the things we're doing. And some things are working. I think we probably got to keep focusing on some areas, but I think one of the greatest things, and you guys might have seen some of this, but our Aboriginal and First Nation partners are really getting a lot more vocal about the importance of the industry to Canada's Indigenous people, and I think that's fantastic, and it's a great message. And frankly, it's really hard to ignore a chief or an elder of a First Nation community who's saying, look, our young people need jobs, and these are great high paying jobs. They're highly technical jobs, so they're giving our kids great training. So I think that has been helpful. I still think the industry has a long way to go in terms of our advocacy. I think that part of the problem is the opponents of our industry have got quite a head start, and as you all know, you got to work a lot harder to overturn a negative impression. You got to have whatever it is, 8 or 9 positive impressions. But I think the industry needs to really start communicating more to just grassroots Americans and Canadians. And I look at the work that API has done with the grassroots, like that kind of thing. I think is really, really positive, and Canada can and should be doing more of that.
I think we totally agree that the grassroots is so important, because even when political leaders understand the problem, even completely, they still look at how their voters perceive the problem, and they tend to obviously want to keep their jobs. And so I think broad-based education is definitely the answer.
Yeah.
So what do you think, as you think about 3 to 5 years out, are there technologies or developments or new initiatives that you've got in your head as you look at the industry or look at Cenovus that you're getting excited about?
Yeah, I think there's a few buckets of things that we are really excited about. And the first I would call just kind of expansion of existing technologies. And I'll give you an example. Cenovus of today, if you look at SAGD well pairs, the industry average is sending those well pairs out about 800 yards, 800 meters into a reservoir. We're now at the point at our company where we're drilling well pairs as long as 2.2 kilometers, 2,200 meters, sort of 2,400 yards, and just things like, when you look at, we now inject steam along that well pair, like in well over 10 locations. It's giving us fantastic conformity of steam across the reservoir, and all of those kind of things are driving down our steam oil ratio, which is really, if you think about it, it's a measure of how much natural gas you're burning to produce a given quantity of oil. So really incredible advances in what I would call, just call it the meat and potatoes, the existing kind of technology. And I think what you're going to see in the next 10 years, you're going to see a lot of SAGD is going to be replaced by either solvent assisted or solvent driven recovery. So what that would mean is, reducing the amount of steam and replacing it with a solvent. And, that could be anything from condensate to propane to butane. And what we're finding, we've been piloting a number of these projects for over a decade. And what we're finding is the ability to just really, really meaningfully reduce the amount of steam that you're having to inject to get a given amount of oil out the other side. And there's obviously huge GHG intensity benefits of doing that. And so I think you're going to see the solvent technology, I think, is going to really become a lot more dominant in the oil sands going forward. And then the final thing I would say, and I kind of put this in the 20-year plus range, but I think, the ultimate end state for the industry is probably small modular reactors, like literally small nuclear reactors, much smaller than the kind that you would see in the power generation sector, more kind of like the reactors you'd see on naval vessels, but ultimately replacing the gas element of steam production in the oil sands with steam produced by nuclear. And that one is quite a long ways out, but it's a pretty fascinating opportunity.
I think we're always getting excited about nuclear and why people aren't talking about it, and then we have to go back to our day jobs. But nuclear is fascinating. What do you think happens, big picture? I know Canada has been a tougher oil and gas environment for a while now. How do you think about the Canadian oil and gas industry and just the overall shape of it and jobs and the future for it? It's made a huge contribution to all of us, but how do you think about that?
Well, Maynard, as I know, Canada represents, I think it's the third largest reserves of oil on the planet. If I remember, I think it's somewhere in the range of 185 billion barrels of proved probable resource. And not only that, we represent, I think it's 50% of all oil that's available for private development worldwide, as opposed to being, in national, owned by a nation. So I think it's an incredible resource. And I think if the challenge has been, there's no challenge with the resource. I think we've demonstrated, time and time again, our ability to continue to improve our cost performance, improve our GHG performance. But if we can't get that oil to market, then we're not going to be able to continue developing the resource. And you're obviously seeing that the impact of Keystone, and Energy East and Northern Gateway, all of which were pipeline proposals to get Canadian oil more access to global markets. I mean, that really is the challenge. The country is landlocked, and without egress, it becomes very, very difficult to continue to grow the industry.
Do you think we got any chance to get Keystone or the other? Like, could this change, or we? What do you think about that? I know you've obviously been around this issue forever.
Yeah. Forever is for sure. I give TC Energy incredible kudos, for their how they stuck to this project, and I don't know where ultimately their final decision lies on it, but I don't care how big and how well capitalized your company is. You can only, it's a question of how long you can kind of fund, the annual burn on a project like Keystone, when you're sort of not only do you have to take care of all the pipe you've bought and the pump stations you've acquired, but you also have to fund all the innumerable lawsuits, coming, that just is a big annual nut. So I right now, I guess we'll wait and see what the final decision is for TC. But I'm suspecting that it's unlikely it's going to proceed in its present form. I just think it's especially with a Democrat in the White House. They've been pretty clear on their views.
It was just such a missed opportunity to power that thing with renewables, get all those jobs in a world that needs them, and obviously all the other benefits to governments and the owners involved. I'm going to get us all upset again, but what a missed opportunity for a win-win for almost everybody.
Yeah, and what I get so frustrated about, and I've talked to American politicians about this till I'm blue in the face, but the saddest thing about it is, the world is not going to consume one less barrel of oil because Keystone didn't get built. The only thing you might do is change the location from where those barrels are produced in. And as we talked about earlier, a world where Venezuela is getting more of its barrels to market, or a world where more Russian barrels are making up for Canadian barrels, anybody who thinks that is a positive environmental benefit, on the bottom line for the planet, I mean, that is just a complete falsehood. And that's a frustration. The environment was not in any way benefited by this decision.
Alex, I'd love to ask you, we're starting to see some headlines coming out of firming up of potential policy and pricing on carbon in Canada. And in the US, some of the larger upstream operators are starting to look at carbon capture and storage technologies. I'm just curious how that may play out in the Canadian landscape and how that might work from an economics perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we're clearly, as an industry, I think, we've come out prior to the Husky deal, we had come out with some GHG reduction targets. Most of our competitors have. And, I think you are increasingly seeing the Canadian industry move towards a view of net zero, at least in the production and transport of the commodity. And, that's obviously going to occur over many decades. And, the message I always say to our government is, look, I mean, to me, these are choices governments make. And the one thing I always tell them is, this is a global market for oil. It's not just a Canadian market. So to the extent you start imposing or you desire to impose those kind of costs on the industry, you got to be very careful, not to render the industry uncompetitive globally. And our view has always been, Canada, really should try, being aligned with the U.S., when it comes to something like carbon tax or GHG, any kind of GHG regulation. I think it'd be very smart for the two countries to be aligned. But I do see it going that way. My own personal view, I'm not terribly opposed to a carbon tax. And the one thing I say to politicians is, if you really believe this, have the courage of your convictions and put it on the end use consumer, because they're the only ones who really have the they're the guys who have the ability to have choices and make decisions. And I think that one of the fears I always see is governments always default to carbon taxes on industry. Well, who's kidding who? Ultimately, we're not producing oil for our benefit. We're producing it for end use consumers. And I just think politicians, who talk a big game about carbon tax are very, very loath to apply it at the consumption level, because those are votes.
Alex, we've seen this emphasis on OPEC Plus and the spare capacity that it has, being close to 8 million barrels per day, and you're also seeing greater attention finally getting paid to non-OPEC, and that maybe these decline rates are really starting to cut into the supply deck. What's your sense of how ready, capable, willing Canadian producers are to fill in any kind of gap? I mean, are we setting up a big problem here? Is it something that Canada could help fill? How do you think about the potential for a sooner than expected problem on the supply side.
Yeah, I mean, like, with Canada, it's kind of this unique situation because our ability to respond to a supply crunch will largely be determined by our success in getting these pipelines built. And I would say that the projects that are still out there, TMX heading to the West Coast, Enbridge's Line 3 expansion, I do expect those projects to go, and I think ultimately to be put in service. And I think that gives a little bit of a cushion for Canadian producers. But one of the amazing things about Canada is, every time we have any spare pipeline capacity, we grow our upstream to take advantage of it. I think we've demonstrated that there's lots of economic development opportunity in the country, but it really is going to be, the success in developing that is really going to be determined by, ability to egress that oil out of get it to world markets.
Do you think, Alex, you mentioned the importance of, for instance, if we had a carbon tax, the U.S. and Canada working together, the U.S. and Canada working together in so many areas it seems like we should always be aligned, right? And I know there's been, and this was kind of our original premise, it felt like people in the United States, government in the United States, people didn't really appreciate the damage you do to a relationship when you do something like this, a Keystone cancellation. Do you have a sense of the damage done or of the state of the relationship, or do we have so many actors involved from different states and agencies and such that it's hard to generalize? But what's the state of our fantastic long-running relationship that just had a unfortunate pothole?
I think you're right, Maynard, in worrying about that. And I often think about it. Here we share the longest undefended border, I think, in the world, and we are each the other country's largest trading partner. And to take a project or to deny a project that was so profoundly important to Canada, I find it unlikely that won't have some kind of long-term problems. And it's as you would know, the Canadian oil and gas industry is incredibly tied to the American oil and gas industry, and certainly in Western Canada, we have this incredible tradition of immigration, kind of north and south. So no, I do very much worry about it, and it's just I think it goes back to this point we talked about earlier, the incredible importance of this industry, and I think most Canadians, I mean, this industry in Canada represents, I think, somewhere close to 40% of all exports in Canada are oil and gas exports. So it is the source of foreign currency. It is the source of our balance of trade, and and anything that really damages, harms that or threatens to harm it long term, it just can't be good for all long term for the relationship between the countries.
You wonder why politicians don't huddle in a room and say, how can we create more jobs? And then I was wondering how we could create more jobs. And then my third question is how we could have more jobs. Like I think they're overcomplicating it. Colin, we have a tradition, Alex. We get to throw fastballs right at Colin sometimes. So I'll give you one, Colin. As you're watching the new administration, it seems like, we had the Syria, the bombing of to get back at Iran. We had sanctions on the Russians announced today because of the poisoning of the dissident there. There have been some elements of Biden so far in the international arena that look, I think you might call them conservative. But when you look at the domestic agenda, it looks more liberal. Is that because Biden has more control outside of our own borders, or what do you think of that assessment? Because these policies sometimes don't seem consistent.
So from a policy standpoint, Biden is a foreign policy person. He spent a lot of time with the judiciary and the foreign policy community over the last however many decades in the Senate back to the early 1970s. So I think, it's not so much conservative as it is traditionalist, playing that role of the United States as the world's policeman. That'd be how I would think of that. Getting back to Dr. Juergen's book, his book is called The New Map, the new book. And a lot of the new map looks to me like the old map. We're still talking about the same countries and a lot of the same issues. And so maybe one way to think about your question is we went to a narrative that very much created these ideas that somehow oil and gas were not going to be part of the geopolitics of the world, and that somehow a Biden administration would be vastly different than its predecessors, most recently Trump. But in the same way that we had President Trump order a strike against an Iranian target, and we've had President Clinton order airstrikes against various targets. This is something that politicians from both parties have done, and really is much more tied to the politics of the Middle East. And so, echoing something Alex said, I think that it's perhaps a bit naive to think that we're going to have this 100 million barrel per day market go down to zero, and that somehow the gas market is going to stop being there. We're going to have a lot of these same geopolitical questions, especially if this pent up demand comes back. And we do need to have these barrels flow from one part of the world to the other. So, my answer to the question, somewhat simplistically, would be certainly the map is getting redrawn in certain ways, but it sure has a lot of the same signposts.
Well, you said Clinton. I think you meant Biden, but Clinton probably bombed some Iranian targets.
No, I mean Clinton too. I mean back to when Clinton in 1998 struck Afghanistan, and some of the first times that we heard about Al Qaeda was with President Clinton in August 1998 ordering airstrikes against two countries at the same time. So that was 1998. That was 23 years ago, and we're still having the same conversation over and over again. So the idea that a Biden administration comes in and somehow it's different, I think is very inconsistent with everything we've seen over the past half century.
Well, let me maybe, Alex, I'll ask a question and maybe try to end on an optimistic note. And thank you so much again for joining us. It's so much fun. When you look at, Colin mentioned at CIRA that John Kerry was using some language about, I'm putting words in his mouth, but pulling away from talking about types of energy sources and just focusing on emissions. That's a pretty quick change, not quite 2 months into the administration. And, they did get a lot of blowback from Keystone. They did hear from a lot of people. The industry we are making some noise for a more balanced energy and environmental discussion. Any chance that even though we've had these setbacks, any chance that in 6, 12, 18 months, we're all feeling a lot better about this conversation? We're trying to push it in an intellectually honest way. And sometimes some of these things, even a carbon tax or whatever you'd call it, that could be a positive because it gets the government out of the way of, having favorite flavors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I mean, the last thing I would ever want to do is or take any positives out of this polar vortex that hit the entirety of North America over the past few weeks. But I do hope that events like that are starting to inject an element of humility into the arguments of the anti-oil and gas people. That this, like I've been saying this for years, but I think, maybe next to clean water and ample food, I don't think there has been any commodity on earth that has done more to preserve and protect the human condition than oil and gas, over the last 100 or 150 years. And what I really want to have is to take all of the hyperbole out of the arguments, and let's just have a really honest view about, if we want to convert, the energy sources of whether it's the U.S. or Canada or wherever, we have to have a real honest discussion about what the implications of that are, and what the puts and takes of it are. And I honestly do believe I have seen a more thoughtful analysis, really, even in the past 2 or 3 weeks, than I've seen for many, many years. And it is just not helpful, when you hear, every six weeks someone comes out with, we have 5 more years till the end of the world, and then we have 5 more years. And I mean, I just think it is good to have a real honest, dispassionate discussion about if we do want to transition, what are the costs going to be, and both in terms of cost to consumers, cost to the environment, or cost to the economy, and frankly, the realistic opportunity that we can do that. So I am hoping that, particularly with the election over, it seems like there might be a little more room for an honest and thoughtful debate about these things.
Well, it's like what you said. The biggest issue with the Keystone decision is it didn't improve the environment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't even get into anything else. And it's almost like we joked about this last week. The U.S. government, the Canadian government, everybody involved, we should be measuring if their policies are improving the problem. And if they are, great. And if they're not, we should talk.
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes me realize we need, Colin, you mentioned this Crossfire. We need that show to come back. If we could get a weekly Crossfire going, maybe we could really advance this debate.
Oh, goodness gracious. I'd go the other way. Let's get like one over Crossfire where we just have the calm, dispassionate people talk about the facts and not, be the apotheosis of each side.
But the problem is, if you could watch Fox and CNN at the same time, they might hold each other accountable. But anyway,
let's go with COBT.
Alex, you are such a great guy to join us. We appreciate you being with us, and we appreciate all you're doing for the industry, because we know you spend a ton of time up in Canada talking to anybody who'll listen about how you see it and what the facts are. So thank you for being such a warrior for all of us.
No worries. And thank you guys for doing this podcast. This is you doing your own part to get the message out. So I really appreciate it, and I appreciate being invited on.
Yes, sir. We're having fun. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.